A new spike in deadly violence has gripped the Democratic Republic of Congo. Armed rebel groups are targeting Ebola healthcare teams and civilians in the country's eastern region. 2 aid workers were killed in one attack over the weekend, and more than a dozen civilians were killed in a separate rebel attack.
This comes as the Congo struggles to contain Ebola. There's more than 200 confirmed cases, including more than 100 deaths. Protests against the new wave of deadly attacks forced health workers to temporarily suspend Ebola aid efforts. For more on this now, we want to bring in CBS News foreign correspondent Debora Patta. She joins us now from Johannesburg, South Africa. So, Deborah, can you just sort of take us through this latest Ebola outbreak? Why is this one so different than the others in the Democratic Republic of Congo?
Well, Anne-Marie, this is really like one of those horrific, mind-bending, unsolvable riddles. How do you contain a deadly virus in an area that is teeming with armed militia? And bear in mind, these armed rebels have been hiding in the forest surrounding this Ebola area since 2003, when the war ended in the DRC. They are used to killing. They are extremely dangerous. And that is one of the problems that they are facing in the DRC right now. This is their 10th Ebola outbreak, but there has never been an Ebola outbreak in a war zone, and that is what they're struggling to contain. The group that is most at risk is, of course, health workers. Now, not only do they face exposure to this deadly virus, but they are also doing their work in a war zone. They report hearing gunfire on a daily basis when they are trying to conduct their work. Just over the weekend, 15 people were killed by these armed militia. A dozen children were kidnapped. Usually they are taken as recruits for these armed groups. And as you mentioned, 2 health workers have been shot dead by these armed rebels. That is what is making things so very difficult. UN health workers are having to go to work under the protection of peacekeeping forces and have to suspend work by sunset to avoid the risk of attack.
Deborah, oftentimes healthcare workers are actually targeted in some African countries by militias, by terrorists. What is behind this latest wave of violence in the DRC? And more importantly, how will it impact containment and treatment efforts in that country?
You know, Vlad, we've learned so many lessons from previous outbreaks, but the one thing that people have not been able to prepare for or even thought about is the possibility of an Ebola outbreak in a war zone, which we're seeing right now in the Democratic Republic of Congo. When this outbreak first occurred on the 1st of August, when it was officially declared, on that very day, armed militia kidnapped 16 people, killed 14 of them. Their bodies turned up in shallow graves a few days later. And 2 teenagers who were taken were kept again, forced to become recruits. Oftentimes, health workers are suspected as the people who are introducing the virus into a country. So there is a lot of distrust to begin with around things like this. And then you have the situation where this is an area that's been at war for a very, very long time. Much of this violence is being blamed on the Allied Democratic Forces. This is an extremist Islamic group that originates from the neighboring country of Uganda. And they have been launching attacks in this area for some time, but most of those attacks have been targeted against the Congolese military or United Nations peacekeeping forces. Of late, though, you've seen increasing indiscriminate attacks on civilians. And what happens in these situations is these terrified residents then flee across the border to Uganda, trying to seek some kind of refuge there. But the problem is that this hurried, untraceable movement is precisely the kind of nightmare that is terrible for an Ebola outbreak when you're trying to contain it, because then you can't trace these people and they may possibly have contracted that virus and then they're gone. There is no way of contacting them in the crazy chaos of a war zone. The World Health Organization has stopped short of declaring this a global health emergency, but they are very concerned about this indeed.
So, Deborah, what can you tell us about this vaccine? Is it something that could be used in the Congo?
It's something that has been very successful in the past, Anne-Marie. We saw in the outbreak that occurred in spring, it was very successful in containing that outbreak very quickly. The World Health Organization says in this particular instance, there's a toxic mixture of factors. They're trying to give as many vaccines as possible, but it is proving very difficult. The faster nurses can prick arms, the more you are able to contain a virus very quickly indeed. But the problem in this particular situation is you have 2 things. On the one hand, you have the normal problems around Ebola, weak infrastructure, poor roads, a poor health system, ignorance around the disease. So they have to start from the beginning in terms of educating people, because in this particular area, they have not had Ebola before, so they're having to start afresh and explaining you can't touch, for example, bodies after the death of a person who has Ebola because they are at their most contagious. So you have all those issues. And now you have this additional problem of a war zone. Usually when it comes to the vaccine, what they do is they draw up lists of everybody the Ebola patient has come into contact with, and then you give the vaccine to all the people who have come into contact with that Ebola sufferer. But in a war zone, that becomes very difficult when you can't actually trace people. Basically, the fact is you cannot vaccinate people whom you don't know exists. And that is what the World Health Organization is facing right now. Normal detective work is failing them because these people have fled across the border or fled the violence, and they're not able to give them this vaccine. What they do when they measure this detective work is they aim for about 90%. That's always been the case when they've given the vaccine out previously in the DRC. 90% of the people the Ebola sufferer has come into contact with have received this vaccination. During this violence right now, that percentage has dropped to 30 to 40%. That is very, very worrying indeed. All the new cases that have been reported, about 50% of them have not been on any contact list. So what you do with Ebola is you try and build up this wall of immunity that Ebola can't penetrate. But you can't build a wall that keeps getting knocked down in an area that is ravaged by violence in a war zone.
It is truly concerning. Debora, thank you very much.